The phone was pressed against Nick's ear when his body gave out. I watched from across our home office as my husband's face went white, then gray, then something I'd never seen before. His free hand clutched his chest as texts flooded his phone screen. 3 different ringtones chimed back to back. Then he collapsed. My scream shattered the Tuesday afternoon quiet. The sound that came out of me wasn't human. It was the sound of a world breaking apart. Nick lay crumpled beside his desk. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and monitors, but in that first moment of forced silence, with only the steady beep of machines measuring his heartbeat, I knew this wasn't just stress. This was something that had been slowly killing the man I loved.
We looked perfect on paper. Nick and Kim Roberts, both 32, successful professionals who never missed church and always brought the good casserole to potlucks. Nick worked at a large consulting firm while I managed marketing for a nonprofit. We had the marriage everyone admired and the life everyone wanted. But perfection has a price nobody talks about. The weight had accumulated so slowly that neither of us noticed, like sediment building up in a riverbed. Each new responsibility seemed reasonable on its own. Nick's father, Joel, had raised him with clear expectations. "You're the oldest son," he'd say during our Sunday dinners. "This family depends on you. It's your duty." So Nick handled his parents' technology problems, their insurance questions, their every crisis, large and small. When his mother, Kathy, needed someone to drive her to appointments, Nick rearranged his schedule. When Joel wanted help with yard work, Nick was there every Saturday. Pastor Ralph saw Nick's reliability and leaned in harder. "God needs strong leaders like you," he'd say, adding another committee, another responsibility, another evening meeting. Nick served on the board, led the men's group, coordinated the annual retreat, and somehow found time to counsel struggling couples. At work, Larry Johnson treated Nick like his personal problem solver. "I need you to handle this too," became Larry's favorite phrase. Client emergencies, staff conflicts, system crashes. Everything landed on Nick's desk because he never said no. He couldn't disappoint people. That wasn't who he was. But the heaviest weight came from me. I didn't realize I was doing it. Every decision, every worry, every small crisis in my day ended the same way. "Nick, what should I do about this?" The broken dishwasher, the weird noise in my car, the conflict with my sister, the choice between job opportunities. I brought it all to him. I thought I was being a good wife by including him in everything. I thought his willingness to solve my problems proved how much he loved me. I had no idea I was slowly drowning the man I'd promised to cherish. Nick carried more than tasks. He carried identities. Son who never disappoints, employee who always delivers, leader who has answers, husband who fixes everything. The weight of being everything to everyone pressed down on his shoulders, his chest, his heart. He was never allowed to just be Nick, never allowed to be human, never allowed to say, "I don't know," or "I can't handle this right now," or "someone else needs to figure this out." We'd built a beautiful prison together, and my husband was suffocating inside it. I never expected to see it so clearly until Nick was lying in that hospital bed. But sitting in the uncomfortable chair beside him, watching the rise and fall of his chest, I finally understood what we'd done. I had made my husband my God. Not intentionally, not consciously, but practically, functionally, completely. Every morning I woke up and turned to Nick without thinking to pray. I didn't think about Jesus at all. Every problem that arose, I ran to Nick. Every decision that needed making, I sought Nick's wisdom before I sought God's. He had become my first responder for everything. Car trouble? Call Nick. Work stress? Nick will know what to do. Family drama? Nick can fix it. Financial worry? Nick has the answers. Even spiritual questions somehow got filtered through him first. I told myself this was what good wives did. We included our husbands. We valued their input. We built decisions together. But somewhere along the way, together had become Nick carries it all. The shift happened so gradually, I missed it completely. When we were newlyweds, I'd pray about things first, then talk to Nick. But as years passed, and Nick proved so capable, so reliable, so willing to solve everything, prayer started feeling unnecessary. Why ask God when Nick always had an answer? I didn't realize I was committing idolatry with a wedding ring on. The theological truth hit me like cold water. When a person becomes your functional savior, when you depend on them for peace, security, and direction more than you depend on Christ, you've created an idol. It doesn't matter that the idol is your husband. It doesn't matter that depending on him feels like love. Nick carried the weight of being my personal Jesus, and it was killing him. But I wasn't the only one feeding this system. Everyone in Nick's life had made him their go-to solution. His parents treated him like their personal tech support and emotional counselor. Pastor Ralph treated him like the answer to every church need. Larry treated him like a one-man problem-solving department. We'd all conspired, without meaning to turn Nick into something he was never meant to be. Not just a husband, son, employee, or church member. We'd made him our functional God. The weight Nick carried wasn't just tasks and responsibilities. It was identities, multiple versions of himself that he had to maintain simultaneously. The cruelest part was how natural it felt. Nick was good at solving problems. He was wise, capable, and genuinely wanted to help people. But somewhere in the process of helping everyone, he'd lost himself. He'd become a function instead of a person. I thought about all the times I'd felt frustrated when Nick seemed stressed or overwhelmed. Why can't he just handle it? I'd wonder. He's always been able to before. I never stopped to ask whether he should be handling it. I never questioned whether the load we'd all placed on him was reasonable or sustainable. I'd mistaken his strength for invincibility. I'd confused his willingness to serve with an unlimited capacity to carry burdens. I'd treated his love like a bottomless well that would never run dry. But wells do run dry, and hearts do break under pressure, and bodies do collapse when the weight becomes too much. Sitting in that sterile hospital room, I finally understood that our marriage had become dangerously unbalanced, not because Nick didn't love me, but because I asked him to love me like God loves me, perfectly, constantly, without limits or boundaries. I'd made him responsible for my peace, my security, my sense of direction. I'd turned him into my functional savior, and then wondered why he seemed so tired all the time. The idol we built together wasn't made of stone or gold. It was made of expectations, dependencies, and the slow erosion of proper boundaries. It was beautiful and deadly, wrapped in the language of love and service, and it had nearly killed the man I loved most. The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and fear. Nick looked small against the white sheets, smaller than I'd ever seen him. Wires and monitors surrounded his bed like electronic sentries, measuring every heartbeat, every breath, every sign that his body was trying to recover from what we'd done to it. Dr. Kelly pulled up a chair beside us, her expression serious but kind. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with tired eyes that had clearly seen this before. Your blood pressure was 180/120 when you came in. That's stroke territory. Your cortisol levels are through the roof, and your heart rate suggests your body has been in fight or flight mode for months. Nick stared at the ceiling. I feel fine most of the time. That's the problem, Dr. Kelly said gently. Your body is saying what you won't. It's screaming that something has to change, but you've been ignoring the signals for so long, you don't hear them anymore. She pulled out a tablet and showed us charts that looked like mountain ranges. This isn't normal stress. This is chronic, sustained pressure that's literally damaging your cardiovascular system. Your body is breaking down from the inside. I felt sick. Is this my fault? Dr. Kelly looked at me with compassion. This isn't about fault. This is about unsustainable patterns. Your husband's body is responding to demands that exceed human capacity. The question is, what are you going to do differently? Nick finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't do this anymore. The words hung in the air like a confession. I can't be the person everyone needs me to be. I can't fix everything. I can't have all the answers. I can't make everyone happy. My heart broke watching him. This strong, capable man who'd carried so much for so long was finally crumbling under the weight we'd all placed on him. I helped put you here. All those times I came to you with problems instead of handling them myself. All those decisions I made you carry. I treated you like you were supposed to be God. Nick turned to look at me, his eyes red with exhaustion and relief. I didn't know how to say no to anyone. I thought if I couldn't handle everything, I was failing as a husband, as a son, as a leader. Dr. Kelly nodded. The physical symptoms are just the visible part. Chronic stress like this affects everything: your immune system, your sleep, your mental clarity, your relationships. Your body has been trying to tell you for months that something has to change. She leaned forward. The good news is that this is reversible, but it requires real changes, not just promises to stress less. You need boundaries. You need to redistribute responsibilities. You need to learn to say no without guilt. But people are depending on me, Nick protested weakly. And if you die from a heart attack, how will that help them? Dr. Kelly asked bluntly. You're not helping anyone by destroying your health. You're modeling unsustainable living and calling it love. The truth of her words hit both of us. Nick's willingness to carry everyone's burdens wasn't actually loving. It was enabling dependency and teaching everyone around him that one person should handle what requires a community. What do we do? Nick asked. You learn to be human again, Dr. Kelly said with a soft smile. Practice saying, I don't know. And that's not my responsibility. And someone else needs to handle this. She pointed at me. You stop treating your husband like he's supposed to be your personal savior. Nick closed his eyes. I don't even know who I am if I'm not fixing everyone's problems. That's what you're going to find out, Dr. Kelly said gently. And I suspect the person you discover will be someone worth knowing. That night in the hospital room, something shifted. The machines had settled into their steady rhythm, and visiting hours were over. It was just Nick and me in the dim light, surrounded by the quiet hum of equipment keeping watch over his healing heart. For the first time in months, maybe years, we had silence. Real silence. No phones buzzing with demands, no texts flooding in with urgent requests, no voices calling Nick's name from 3 different rooms. Just us. And in that stillness, I sensed someone else. We need to pray, I whispered. But even as I said it, I realized how those words would have sounded different just days before. Then prayer would have been something we added to our problem solving, a nice spiritual touch after we'd figured out our real plan. Now, prayer felt like breathing, like the only thing that made sense. Nick reached for my hand, his fingers trembling slightly, but his grip was steady. I don't even know what to ask for. Maybe that's the point, I said, swallowing back tears. We sat there in the darkness, and I felt the weight of everything we'd been carrying without God. All those decisions I'd brought to Nick instead of to Christ. All those burdens he'd shouldered instead of casting them on the one who actually invited us to bring our heavy loads to him. I'd been living like Jesus was a nice addition to our marriage instead of the foundation of it. The shift happened gradually, then all at once. Instead of, "Jesus, help us figure this out," I prayed, "Jesus, we're yours. Show us how to live in that reality." For years, I'd prayed around the edges of our life. I'd asked God to bless our decisions, to help our plans succeed, to make our burdens lighter. But I'd never actually surrendered the decision-making to him. I'd never truly cast any burdens on him. I'd treated God like a consultant instead of my Lord. "I need you to stop asking me to solve your problems all the time," Nick said. The words stung, even though I knew they were necessary. "I don't always." "You do," he said gently. "Every day, multiple times a day, and I need you to stop." I felt defensive, then guilty, then scared. But what if I really need help? Ask God first. Try to figure it out yourself. Call a friend. Research solutions. Use me as a last resort, not a first response all the time. The fear was immediate and overwhelming. What if I made the wrong decision? What if I handled something badly? What if I needed him and he wasn't available? "I don't know how not to depend on you," I admitted. "That's exactly the problem, and it's exactly what we need to fix." "I think I've been trying to be your everything," Nick said quietly. "I shouldn't have done that." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. He had been, and I'd let him. We'd both participated in a system where Nick carried what only Christ should carry. "And I've been treating you like you were, and that was wrong," I admitted. In that moment, I saw our marriage differently, not as two people trying to make it work on their own, but as three. Christ wasn't supposed to be a guest in our relationship. He was supposed to be the foundation, the center, the source. I thought about the triangle I'd heard about in premarital counseling years ago. The pastor had drawn it on a whiteboard. The husband and wife at the bottom corners, Christ at the top. The closer you each get to Christ, the closer you get to each other. But we'd been living like a straight line, just Nick and Kim pulling in different directions, with Christ somewhere off to the side, waiting patiently. "We need to actually put Jesus first," Nick said. "Not just in theory, but practically. Instead of you asking me what to do, ask him first, and then we can pray about it if you're still not clear." The idea was revolutionary and terrifying. It meant admitting we didn't have control. It meant trusting someone we couldn't see with decisions that felt urgent and important. But it also meant freedom. Freedom from the crushing weight of being in charge of everything. Knowing Jesus loved me and Nick more than we would ever love each other or ourselves made the decision easier. Plus, Jesus wanted the best for us. "I want to try," I whispered. For the first time since Nick's collapse, I felt hope. Not hope that we could fix this ourselves, but hope that we didn't have to.
The conversations we needed to have felt impossible before we started them. But lying in that hospital bed, Nick had found something I'd never heard in his voice before. Quiet determination mixed with desperate necessity. His parents came first. Joel and Kathy arrived at the hospital with their usual energy, already planning Nick's recovery around their needs. "Once you're feeling better, we really need you to look at our computer," Kathy said, settling into the visitor's chair.
And Joel, put off that gutters project until you can help. I watched Nick's blood pressure monitor climb slightly. Mom, Dad, Nick said, his voice steady but firm. We need to talk about some changes. Joel leaned forward. What kind of changes? I can't be your go-to person for everything anymore. I love you both, but I need you to find other solutions for your problems. Hire someone to do the yard work and fix whatever you can't fix around the house. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Kathy's face showed genuine confusion. But you're our son. Family helps family. Family also doesn't kill each other with expectations. I'm not saying I'll never help, but I can't be your first call for every issue. I can't rearrange my life around your convenience anymore. Joel's jaw tightened. This is what marriage counselors teach you? To abandon your parents? I felt my chest tighten, but Nick remained calm. This is what nearly dying teaches you, that loving people doesn't mean destroying yourself to serve them. The conversation lasted an hour. There were tears, accusations, and long silences, but Nick held firm. He would visit on some Sundays, help with genuine emergencies, but the weekly list of projects, the constant tech support calls, the assumption that his time belonged to them, all of that had to stop. We raised you better than this, Kathy said as they left. You raised me to serve, but you didn't teach me that service has limits. I'm learning that now. The meeting with Pastor Ralph was even harder. Ralph came to the hospital with his usual warm smile and a stack of papers. I brought some things for you to review when you're feeling up to it. The men's retreat planning committee really needs your input, and we're behind on the budget proposal. Nick didn't even look at the papers. Ralph, I need to step back from leadership roles. Step back? Nick, you're one of our strongest leaders. The church needs you. The church needs healthy leaders. I can serve, but I can't lead right now. I can attend Bible study, but I can't facilitate it. I can participate, but I can't be responsible for outcomes. This seems like a temporary setback once you recover. This isn't temporary. I've been carrying responsibilities that belong to the whole congregation. That's not healthy for me or for the church. Ralph looked genuinely confused, but God gives us strength to serve Him. God also gives us wisdom to know our limits, I said, surprising myself by speaking up. We've been treating Nick like he's supposed to have God's strength instead of human strength. The conversation grew tense. Ralph spoke about commitment, about not being a fair weather servant, about the danger of selfishness disguised as self-care. But Nick held his ground. I can serve from my gifts and availability, but I can't serve from obligation and guilt anymore. If that makes me selfish, then I guess I'm learning to be appropriately selfish. When Ralph left, he seemed more confused than angry, but the papers stayed on the bedside table, untouched. The workplace conversation happened over the phone. Larry Johnson called during visiting hours, his voice tight with frustration. Nick, I need you to walk me through the Morrison account. The client is freaking out and nobody else understands your system. Nick, I'm in the hospital. I know, but this will just take 5 minutes. I watched Nick's face change. The old Nick would have spent the next hour solving Larry's crisis from his hospital bed. The new Nick took a breath. That's not going to work for me. What do you mean? I mean, I'm not available for work calls while I'm in the hospital recovering from a stress-related health crisis that was partially caused by work demands. Larry's voice sharpened. Nick, this is your job. You can't just abandon your responsibilities. I'm not abandoning anything. I'm establishing boundaries. When I return to work, we need to have a serious conversation about workload distribution and emergency protocols that don't depend on one person being available 24/7. This isn't how we've operated before, and look at where that got us," Nick said, gesturing to the hospital room around him. The call ended awkwardly, but Nick looked more relaxed than he had in days. The fear of disappointing others felt crushing. Nick's parents were hurt and confused. Pastor Ralph seemed betrayed. Larry was frustrated and demanding. Even some of our friends didn't understand why Nick was being selfish during his recovery. But watching Nick's blood pressure readings improve each day he held his boundaries, I began to understand something crucial. Disappointing others was better than destroying ourselves. The people who truly loved us would adjust to the new boundaries. The people who only loved what Nick did for them would reveal themselves through their resistance. The first morning home from the hospital, I woke up with a familiar anxiety knot in my stomach. The dishwasher was making a weird noise. I had a difficult conversation with my boss scheduled for later, and I couldn't find the warranty information for our washing machine that had started acting up. My automatic response was immediate. "Nick, can you—" I stopped myself mid-sentence. Nick was sitting at the kitchen table, reading his Bible with a cup of coffee. He looked up expectantly, and I saw something I'd never noticed before. A slight tension around his eyes, a barely perceptible bracing for whatever I was about to ask him to handle. "Never mind," I said. "I've got it." But I didn't have it. I had no idea how to handle any of these things without Nick's input. For 7 years of marriage, he'd been my first responder for every uncertainty, every decision, every problem that felt too big for me to handle alone. I poured my own coffee and sat across from him. "I was about to ask you to fix 3 different things." "I know," he said gently. "I don't know how not to do that." "Neither do I, but we're going to figure it out together." The shift started small. Instead of immediately bringing my work stress to Nick, I started bringing it to prayer first. Not the quick, desperate prayers I'd drawn up while walking to find Nick, but actual, quiet time, having conversations with Jesus about whatever bothered me. The first few times felt awkward and insufficient. Prayer seemed too slow, too uncertain. Nick's advice was immediate and practical. God's guidance required patience and faith. But inside, something began to change. The conversation with my boss that I'd been dreading, after praying about it, I realized I'd been overthinking it. The dishwasher noise, a quick online search revealed it was normal for our model. The washing machine warranty, I found it in our files after looking for 15 minutes instead of asking Nick to find it for me. "I handled 3 things today without asking you," I told Nick that evening with a sense of pride. He smiled, and I saw something I hadn't seen in months: relief. But the bigger shift was internal. Each time I chose prayer over panic, each time I chose to sit with uncertainty instead of immediately seeking Nick's certainty, I felt something I'd forgotten: peace. The freedom was intoxicating. When my sister called with her latest drama, instead of immediately saying, "Let me talk to Nick about this," I found myself saying, "Let me pray about this and call you back." When a financial decision came up, instead of defaulting to Nick's analysis, I spent time researching and praying before bringing him my thoughts instead of my helplessness. Nick noticed the change immediately. "You seem calmer, more confident, like you trust yourself again." I thought about that. I think I'm learning to trust God first, which makes me trust myself more. The relief in Nick's face was profound. For the first time since his collapse, he looked truly relaxed. Not because he was avoiding responsibility, but because the weight of being my functional savior had been lifted. I didn't realize how heavy it was, being the person you turn to for everything. I thought I was including you. I thought I was being a good wife by bringing you my problems. You are a good wife, but you stopped trying to handle your problems and dumped them on me." The words still stung, but they were true. Small victories began accumulating. I navigated a difficult conversation with my mother without coaching from Nick. I made a minor financial decision independently, and it worked out fine. I handled a work crisis by praying, thinking, and acting instead of immediately calling for backup. Each small success built my confidence. More importantly, each act of turning to God first instead of Nick first strengthened my relationship with Christ. "I feel like I'm getting to know you again," Nick said one morning as we sat together reading our Bibles. "What do you mean?" "For years, you've been Kim who needs me to solve things. Now you're becoming Kim who trusts God with things. I like her." I liked her too. She was braver than I remembered, more capable, more connected to the source of actual wisdom and peace. Instead of bringing Nick my anxiety, I brought him my peace after spending time with God. Instead of making him responsible for my emotional state, I made Christ responsible and came to Nick from a place of rest instead of desperation. The change wasn't just in me. Nick began to relax in ways I hadn't since our early dating days. He laughed more, seemed lighter. The constant tension of being everyone's solution had lifted from his shoulders. "I feel human again," he told me one evening. I said, "You are human. I just forgot that for a while." We were learning something profound. When Christ is the foundation, everything else can be built properly. When he's not, even the most beautiful relationships become dangerously unbalanced. I was discovering that depending on God first didn't make me need Nick less. It made me able to love him better. From overflow instead of desperation, from choice instead of compulsion. The mornings looked different now. Instead of Nick's phone buzzing with urgent requests before he'd even finished his coffee, we started each day with silence. Real silence. The kind where we could actually hear each other breathe. We'd learned to protect our time like it was sacred, because it was. Sunday mornings used to be a frantic rush of obligations. Church service, lunch with Nick's parents, afternoon meetings, evening events. Every moment scheduled, every transition hurried. Now we went to church and came home. That was it. "But what about lunch with your parents?" Kathy had asked the first Sunday we declined. "We're spending the afternoon together," Nick had replied simply. "Just us." The guilt tried to creep in. Shouldn't we be more available? Shouldn't we say yes to more opportunities to serve? But then I'd remember Nick's blood pressure readings, the gray color his face had turned that Tuesday afternoon, and the guilt would fade into gratitude. We were learning that saying no was an act of worship. But the changes weren't just about what we stopped doing. They were about what we started prioritizing. Morning prayer became non-negotiable. Evening conversations became sacred. Rest became a spiritual discipline instead of something we'd get to eventually. The surprising peace that followed our obedience was immediate and profound. I'd expected to feel guilty about disappointing people. Instead, I felt free. I'd expected Nick to seem less important without all his responsibilities. Instead, he seemed more himself than he'd been in years. I forgot what it felt like to not be tired all the time. He told me one evening as we sat together reading. "I forgot what it felt like to have a husband instead of a crisis manager," I replied. Our new rhythm wasn't perfect. There were still days when the old patterns tried to reassert themselves. Days when Nick's phone would ring with urgent requests and he'd feel the familiar pull to say yes to everything. Days when I'd catch myself about to dump my anxiety on him instead of taking it to God first. But we'd learned to recognize the warning signs, the tension in Nick's shoulders when he was taking on too much, the edge in my voice when I was depending on him instead of Christ. the sense of hurry that used to define our lives. "We're getting good at this," Nick said one evening as we sat together on the porch, watching the sunset without anywhere else to be. "Good at what?" "Good at living like we belong to God instead of everyone else's expectations." He was right. We were learning that our time, our energy, our peace, all of it belonged to Christ first. Everyone else got what overflowed from that relationship, not what was left after we had exhausted ourselves trying to meet every demand. The rhythm we'd found wasn't just sustainable, it was joyful. If you want to see more stories of faith restoring what seems broken, subscribe and let us know in the comments what God is teaching you about His design for relationships.